Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 292, Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley is almost here. It goes down on August 19th in Boston, and this is going to be my top 3 reasons I love UFC 292. I'm going to start with some honorable mentions, then I'm going to go from 3 to 1, 1 being the reason I most love UFC 292, and I've already done the top 3 reasons I hate UFC 292. If you want to check that out, I will link it down in the description. But before we get into anything, comment down below, what is the reason you are most looking forward to UFC 292? I'm genuinely curious. So starting off with my first honorable mention, and honestly, this barely made the honorable mentions, but that is that Ian Garry will get his grappling tested at UFC 292. I'm super disappointed that Ian Garry versus Jeff Neal got canceled, but at least we'll kind of see the grappling of Ian Garry tested against Neil Magny, because I'm pretty confident that Neil Magny is going to go out there and attempt to clinch up with Ian Garry, look to take him down, look to wrestle him. And even though we're not going to get that many answers about where Ian Garry's skill set is against Neil Magny, where we would have gotten a lot of answers against Jeff Neal, at least we'll kind of get a very small gauge on how good Ian Garry's grappling is against Neil Magny. Because Neil Magny has a decent, well-rounded skill set, and he's an okay grappler, but he gets out-grappled by elite grapplers. So it doesn't answer all that much, but we'll get a little bit of information regarding Ian Garry's grappling against a top 15 guy in Neil Magny. Moving on to my next honorable mention, and that is that Chris Weidman could have a fairy tale return at UFC 292. A little bit questionable on this. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. That's why it's an honorable mention. But Chris Weidman returning from that brutal leg break against Uriah Hall back at UFC 261. And he was already on a downslope in his career. And now he's finally returning over 2 years later from that leg break. He's fighting Brad Tavares, which at the time that Weidman broke his leg, it would have been a manageable opponent for him. It would have been a winnable fight. And honestly, I don't really see him getting this one done, but I think there is a chance. And I think it would be really awesome to see Chris Weidman returning from a catastrophic injury and getting a win against Brad Tavares. And I think there is a chance. He's talked about, oh, I want to make another title run. He could just be full of it. He could just be saying that. There's a chance maybe he comes back, gets a win against Brad Tavares, maybe he gets a crazy stoppage win, and then maybe he retires in the cage and has a fairy tale ending, because he's already getting up there in age. He's already in his late 30s. He's coming back off a catastrophic injury. I don't think he can make a run in the top 15 of the division, but there's a chance we see a fairy tale return where he gets a win against Brad Tavares. And it'll just be cool to see him get that win after returning from such a catastrophic injury. And, a lot of people speculated he might have retired after that. And I think it would have been a horrible way for him to go out, but a lot of people wouldn't have returned from that. And for him to come back, get a win, maybe that's enough for him to say, you know what? I don't need to do this anymore. I'll move on to coaching and stuff like that. So that's why it's an honorable mention, just because it may not happen. We may see the complete opposite, but there's a chance Weidman could come back and get a win against Brad Tavares. Moving on to my last honorable mention, and that is that Natalia Silva is fighting at UFC 292. Now, this fight's kind of buried all the way down the card, but we're getting Natalia Silva versus Andrea Lee. And some of you guys may not know who Natalia Silva is. She is a very good women's flyweight prospect. She's 3-0 in the UFC. She has a win over Jasmine Jadavicius. She has a win over Teresa Bleda, where she beat her via spinning back kick. And most recently, she finished Victoria Leonardo. So 2 finishes out of 3 fights. I think she's a future contender in the flyweight division, and it's crazy to see the flyweight division really start to pick up with potential prospects. I mean, you got Grasso, you got Shevchenko, who's no longer the champion. You have Erin Blanchfield making her way up the ranks. You have Natalia Silva. There's so many great prospects in the women's flyweight division, and I think Natalia Silva is one of those prospects. And she's getting a good test against Andrea Lee, because Andrea Lee, in my opinion, she just beat Macy Barber, and she got robbed in that fight. So this is a great matchup for her to really test her skill set and prove that she is a future contender in the women's flyweight division. And she's so fun to watch. She has elite striking. She has very good grappling. She has finishing ability, which is very rare to see, especially in terms of KO or TKOs. in the women's divisions. You know, you don't see a lot of stoppages outside of submissions. So she looks like she's a future prospect. She looks like she's a future contender, but we're really going to find out. We're going to get a good gauge on her skill set against Andrea Lee at UFC 292. So I'm really looking forward to seeing Natalia Silva fight. I think she could be a future champion. Moving on to my actual list, starting off with number 3. And this one's kind of diminished. It was much better at one point in time, but that is that we are getting a bunch of bantamweight fights on UFC 292. We have the main event, Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley for the bantamweight championship. We also have Cody Garbrandt versus Mario Batista, another really good bantamweight fight. I don't know, Cody Garbrandt, former champion, I don't know where he's currently at. He didn't look that good against Trevin Jones, and he's fighting an absolute killer in Mario Batista, so that's another interesting fight. You also have Marlon Vera versus Pedro Munoz. That is an excellent bantamweight fight as well. Now, initially, this fight card was much better in terms of the bantamweight fights because you had Rob Font versus Song Yadong, which I really wish was still in this card. And also, you originally had, it was speculated, it was never official, Henry Cejudo versus Merab Dvalishvili, and then you had Henry Cejudo versus Marlon Vera, which then got canceled because Cejudo was injured. But I love seeing one weight class featured prominently on one card because it's always nice to match make after that fact. So in this case, you have 3 really good bantamweight fights, and we can kind of match make after this. Now, obviously, I don't think any of the 2 undercard bantamweight fights are not even undercard fights, but the 2, you know, the Cody Garbrandt versus Mario Batista or Marlon Vera versus Pedro Munoz, I don't think either one of those guys are going to fight for a title in the near future, but it's still fun to kind of progress them through the division and see all these guys from a weight class compete on one card is awesome. It would have been much better, and this would have been number 1 on the list had we got Henry Cejudo versus Merab Dvalishvili and Rob Font versus Song Yadong, along with Cody Garbrandt versus Mario Batista and Pedro Munoz versus somebody else. It would have been number 1 on the list because I love seeing a weight class just featured predominantly on a card. And the only time the UFC really did this was many, many years ago. They did an all heavyweight pay-per-view card. And obviously in this case, you would still have Weili Zhang versus Amanda Lemos as the co-main event since it's for the title. But I wish the UFC would do more of this. Imagine an entire lightweight main card on a pay-per-view. That'd be incredible. Imagine an entire bantamweight main card on a pay-per-view. Now this one, we get 3 out of 5. I think that's really good. I'm really looking forward to it. And I think there's some fun matchups. Moving on to my number 2 reason I love UFC 292. And this is not being talked about enough. This is not being talked about enough, and I'm guilty of this as well. I'm not hyping this up enough because really we should be super excited for it, and that is the co-main event, Weili Zhang versus Amanda Lemos for the women's strawweight title. This is a banger of a women's title fight. I mean, I know women's MMA in general gets a lot of flack. This is an amazing, amazing, amazing matchup. It's a super fan-friendly matchup, and Weili Zhang, I mean, she's probably the most exciting women's fighter on the UFC roster. I'll never forget her fight against Joanna Jędrzejczyk, the first one. Absolutely incredible. One of the best fights I've ever seen. That was back in 2020. One of the best fights I've ever seen. Definitely the best women's fight of all time. And Weili Zhang looked incredible, you know, since then as well. I mean, she retired Joanna Jędrzejczyk. She won the belt against Carla Esparza, put her in the crucifix position. She has 2 losses to Rose Namajunas. The first fight, she just got caught and brutally head kick KO'd in the first round. Second fight was razor close, and I actually scored it for Weili Zhang. So you have her, and then she goes out there and KOs Joanna Jędrzejczyk with a spinning back fist, you know, just last year, last May or last June. And then you have Amanda Lemos, who a lot of people don't really know her. She's incredible. She just finished Marina Rodriguez. A lot of people thought Marina Rodriguez was a future title contender. So, you know, you look at her and you look at her recent fights, she's got a finish over Michelle Waterson Gomez, which isn't the greatest finish, but she's a finisher. She has power. She has nasty hands. She has good jiu-jitsu. This is an amazing matchup that none of the fans are really discussing. Nobody's really talking about. And I think we could be in store. It could be a quick finish, don't get me wrong, but I'm so happy that this fight is 5 rounds. Obviously, it's for the belt, but this is a phenomenal matchup. It's a phenomenal fan-friendly matchup. Obviously, there's no real backstory there. There's no real, oh, well, she said this and she said that. There's nothing really, there's no real drama behind the matchup, but skill for skill, I can't wait to see this fight. Lemos, the only loss she has in the last few years is against Jessica Andrade, and she got caught in a standing arm triangle in the first round. So, you know, you go back, I think you book Amanda Lemos versus Jessica Andrade right now, I would favor Lemos in that fight. And I know Andrade just kind of had a downslope, but either way, I don't think losing via arm triangle in the first round is indicative of her skill set right now, because I think she's really good. I think she has finishing ability. I think she has excellent stand-up. I think she has good grappling, good jiu-jitsu. And Weili Zhang, I mean, she's good everywhere. Excellent grappling, excellent striking, finishing power. And honestly, I think one of these girls could get a finish in this fight. So I really think people should really be looking forward to this co-main event, and it should be being talked about more. But because of the lack of the backstory, because of the lack of drama, and also because of the fact it is women's MMA, it's being massively overlooked on this card. And the more I think about it, and I've kind of been overlooking it myself as well, but the more I think about it, I think we're in for a war. I think we're potentially in for a finish. And I think we could be in store for one of the best female MMA fights in history. Now, that's tough to say just looking at it on paper, but I just think their skill sets match up so well, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this matchup. There is no way it's going to end up like Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza 2. Ew! I mean, this fight, no matter how it goes down, even if it's one of the most boring performances either girl can put on ever in their entire careers, it'll still be better than Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza 2. So I really think we should be giving a little bit more hype to this co-main event. I'm really looking forward to Weili Zhang versus Amanda Lemos for the women's strawweight title. Moving on to my number one reason I am looking forward to UFC 292, and that is that the Sean O'Malley hype will die. I believe the Sean O'Malley hype will die at UFC 292. And even to kind of make this a little bit of a broader reason, I love UFC 292 because no matter what, we're going to see Aljamain Sterling or Sean O'Malley lose. And I know that sounds very obvious and very simple, but I'm not a massive fan of either guy. But Sean O'Malley is one of the most overrated and overhyped fighters in the UFC. And I really think it's just 16-year-olds who wear marijuana leaf tube socks and, smoke weed and vape, and they're like, oh, O'Malley's so good. O'Malley has one win against a fighter currently on the UFC roster, and it's a brutal robbery win over Petr Yan. The only other decent fighter that he's fought who's still on the UFC roster, oh, guess what? It's Marlon Chito Vera, and guess what happened in that fight? He got his legs brutally chopped, he got shucked to the ground, and then he got flash KO'd with brutal ground and pound elbows, and then he was stretchered out of the cage with no serious injuries. So Sean O'Malley is getting hyped up so much, and the UFC so desperately wants him to be a star, even though he's bland on the mic to be generous. And people are hyping him up so much. And don't get me wrong, I think he has a chance in this fight. But I just find it hard to believe if Petr Yan is taking you down at will. And don't get me wrong, Petr Yan's a decent grappler, but Aljamain Sterling prioritizes control time rather than damage. And I think Aljamain Sterling should be able to go out there, and this is a little bit of an early prediction. Who knows? I might change my mind. I don't know. I doubt it. But I think Aljamain Sterling should go out there and ragdoll him and be able to control him and eventually probably find a finish, if not win a very dominant, grappling-heavy decision. And I think the hype ends right there. The UFC kind of threw him to the wolves against Petr Yan, and he got gifted a decision. And now people are, I don't think anyone live scored that for Sean O'Malley. And then afterwards, he gets the robbery decision, and all the Sean O'Malley fans start playing revisionist history and saying, oh, well, if you could give him the first and third. I thought he lost 30-27. People go, oh, the knee and the damage in the third round. That's the only damage he did. None of those follow-up strikes even landed. But this video isn't the place to debate that. Either way, I believe the hype of Sean O'Malley ends at UFC 292 because if Aljamain Sterling finishes him, I mean, where does he go from there? Obviously, he can build back up. He's still young. I think he can. But the initial hype of, oh, Sean O'Malley's going to be champion. He beat Petr Yan. He's coming for Aljamain Sterling. He's going to brutally KO him. It's going to end at UFC 292. And what makes it even better is the UFC, and I'm thinking about making a dedicated video on this. Let me know if you want this in the comments. The UFC is trying to sabotage Aljamain Sterling. They desperately want him to lose to Sean O'Malley at UFC 292 with the quick turnaround, with the back-to-back weight cuts. And it's going to be so satisfying. Dana White may leave the arena. He may pull a UFC 270 Ngannou versus Gane when Ngannou wins and Dana White storms out of the arena, refuses to put the belt on his champion. If Aljamain Sterling goes out there and backpacks Sean O'Malley to a 50-45, Dana White is going to be furious. And I was initially in this matchup, I was rooting for Sean O'Malley because I didn't really like Aljamain Sterling and the way he got the title. But as time has gone on, I've kind of, learn to forgive that a little bit, that Oscar award-winning performance. And I'm not talking about power slap by any means, or an Emmy win for power slap like Dana White suggests. But I kind of forgiven it over time. He's kind of proven himself. He went out there and beat Piotr Jan in a very close fight. I even scored it for Jan, but it was not a robbery. He goes out there and just mauls TJ Dillashaw. He goes out there and beats Henry Cejudo in a hard-fought 5-round fight. And now he's fighting this hype job of Sean O'Malley where the UFC's trying to set him up for failure. And it's just going to be very, very satisfying to see Aljamain Sterling go out there and ragdoll Sean O'Malley and defeat him and potentially finish him at UFC 292. And that's why it's my #1 reason. All the 16-year-old guys who are smoking pot 24/7 and they're illegally streaming the pay-per-view are going to be crying the night of UFC 292 when Sean O'Malley potentially gets submitted by Aljamain Sterling or potentially gets 50-45'd by Aljamain Sterling via grappling and via the backpacking that Aljamain Sterling loves to do. But let me know what you guys think of all my reasonings down in the comments. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.